Oh, let's get right into it. Chris Haugh and Repudiation Day, 1765, 8 years before the Boston Tea Party. Tell us what happened in Frederick County.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me, Ed, and it's good to be back here and seeing familiar faces. Some from, of course, north of the river, but I do recognize some folks who were here the last time. We talked about Mary Quantrell in here. I probably caused quite a stir during that. But today, Ed had asked me months ago if I would. Well, I guess, yeah, you're right. We were talking about two things: Session Barracks and the Stamp Act, and getting back to the Revolutionary War period. It's very interesting for me. As Ed mentioned, I'm the historian over at Mount Olivet, and Mount Olivet actually opened in 1854, but we have a lot of people that were reinterred, or not reinterred, but moved from the older historic cemeteries that were originally in downtown Frederick. So we have a lot of people from the colonial period there too. So from week to week, I range from this. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've been giving Halloween oriented or fall oriented tours that aren't necessarily ghost tours, but talk about unsettling things in there. Veterans Day, with Veterans Day, I've been giving tours and lectures the last couple of weeks about veterans from all the different conflicts. And we have over 4,000 veterans there in Mount Olivet. As talked about, I do a weekly blog, so I'm always bouncing between periods. But it's been a little while since I've done anything Revolutionary War connected. And I can't believe it's been 7 years. Is where we had the 250th anniversary of this Stamp Act repudiation in Frederick. And I was on the lecture circuit and taught a few classes and conducted a few tours connecting to that. And also it just was a great lead into at least Frederick's role, or the region's role, in the American Revolution. So it's really neat to kind of look back on this, because I had a lot of fun researching the Stamp Act. It's something I had heard about a long time ago. It's just like a lot of things in, well, not only Frederick, but anywhere that you go, when you have local legends and history, it just seems there's too many other distractions going on, whether it be professional sports or Dancing with the Stars or social media influencers, that back in the day, you could bring up the Stamp Act repudiation and people were like, yeah, I'm already making my plans for that half-day bank holiday of what I'm going to do in the afternoon to celebrate or commemorate. And today, I think I mentioned to my sons when I was leaving the home that I'm talking about the Stamp Act, and they were like, what's the Stamp Act again? And it's the same thing as we talk about stars like Barbara Fritchie, and in some cases, even Francis Scott Key, who's buried at Mount Olivet. Who are those people again? Where I think we can look at our childhoods for whatever period they were, and historical figures, I think, were more at the forefront. And when I bring up on a tour the name's Barbara Fritchie, I don't have people saying, oh yeah, she's the one who started a diner there in Frederick, and they made great breakfast foods and pies. It had nothing to do, well, it does, but it doesn't. But anyway, back to the Stamp Act. And I had a lot of fun. I did a number of different lectures on it, because there's not only just the surface level, which we're going to talk about today, but maybe in the question and answer portion, I'll be happy to wax poetic on some of my findings. I love looking at these stories in history. I love myth busting. I love looking at embellishments. But I also, where there's smoke, there's fire. So a lot of things that sometimes are even discounted by historians, like that didn't happen or that couldn't have happened. Well, just maybe there was some part of that that was true, and to kind of look below the surface. And that was one of the things when I was here with you last, talking about Mary Quantrell, who, in my opinion, was the real Barbara Fritchie. It's something that people have had, it was completely new. But at the same time, it brings up the importance of a person like Barbara Fritchie, who put Frederick on the map as a tourism destination and a history destination because of that poem that was written by John Greenleaf Whittier. And I probably wouldn't have had the career in public history that I've had for over 30 years hadn't it been for Barbara Fritchie existing in the first place. But with the Stamp Act repudiation, like I said, afterwards, I'll kind of get in to some other things. But just on the surface level, let's go. Stamp collecting. Stamp collecting was great. I had an aunt, my Aunt Betty, my grandmother's sister, who introduced stamp collecting to me when I was a young kid. And, you know, you kind of play the game, especially with an aunt, a doting aunt. We lived in Maryland and she lived in Delaware. My aunt bought me a stamp collecting book and got me started on it. And yeah, it was great. I mean, I like collecting football and baseball cards more than stamp collecting, but stamp collecting was kind of a little entree to the world and seeing these exotic places and figuring out how to pronounce the countries and stuff. But my aunt made it a habit of sending me almost a letter or a parcel each week filled with stamps, extra stamps. So they almost got unruly. I had more stamps than I know what to do with. And it was neat when I was doing this research on the Stamp Act, I started thinking back to my early stamp collecting days, which I've long past that. But stamps themselves are interesting. And what are stamps? And of course, now in an age where emails are sent much more commonly, you know, alleviated in fact. And I just noticed, and I think all of us just noticed that really over the last month, we received more mail than probably the previous months of the whole year, because we got all those political parcels in. Now, none of them had stamps per se, as a bulk mail, but you know, stamps and envelopes are a thing kind of they're weaning from the past. But with this Stamp Act, which is pretty neat, a lot of times you hear it get lumped in with the American Revolution somehow. Maybe it's not as sexy as the Boston Tea Party, but basically the message, the theme was kind of the same, kind of a taxation without representation. And that's exactly what we have with the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, as you can see on the screen and at home there, that on March the 22nd of 1765, King George III actually had put forth, and you can see here a printed page here, which announces an act for granting and applying certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies and plantations in America towards further defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing securing. Let's see here, I'm looking at two screens at once here, but defending, protecting, and securing the same, and for amending such parts of several acts of Parliament relating to the trade and revenues of the said colonies and plantations, as direct the manner of determining and recovering the penalties and forfeitures therein mentioned. Anyway, it goes on, but what it was really, Parliament kind of got behind this, and it was this this tax here on that would be placed on stamped paper, and it was really to help pay for the protection that the Crown had given us in the French and Indian War, and to also pay for the existing officers and soldiers that were here to protect us from invading hostile Indian tribes, and of course the French and anybody else who was out there. So this is what the Stamp Act was at. It was or was about. It was supposed to commence November 1st of 1765. And again, the French and Indian War conflict, again, another one that's not doesn't easily roll off the tongue, and it isn't as sexy as the Revolution or the Civil War. But the French and Indian War, basically from that 1754 to 1763 era. And of course, in Frederick, we've got a connection with General Braddock, who took half of his army and stayed in, they were, I guess, staging for the event. So half of his army was there, half of the army, I think, was in Winchester, and they would both head west and meet there in Cumberland at Fort Wills, and then go to Fort Duquesne. And it was an ill-fated trip for Braddock, where he would be killed there. George Washington was invited along to go as a guest. He wasn't the George Washington that we know as the great general. He was just kind of invited because he knew the terrain, port necessity, and all that. But that's a lecture for another time. But this is kind of the context of the Stamp Act. And this new tax was imposed on all American colonists, and it required them to pay a tax, but on a multitude of things. Ships' papers, which were very important with trade going back and forth. to Great Britain. Legal documents, licenses, newspapers had this situation where they would have to use stamped paper, other publications, and even playing cards. So again, it wasn't just so much a stamp the way that we know it, like a stamp collection stamp. This was actually stamped vellum or stamped parchment that was in question. And as you could imagine, this created quite a stir because public officials, or at least officials there, government officials, would need this to utilize this stamp paper for all transactions, land transactions, civil transactions, etc. Newspapers. Imagine publishing your own newspaper, but now you had to use this special paper. You couldn't use the existing paper you were using, but you had to use a special paper, special tax paper. So again, people were up in arms, and when word of this tax reached America in late spring of 1765, the colonists were furious. A secret society had formed to protect the rights of colonists and to fight taxation by the British government. Does anybody know what that secret society was called? Sons of Liberty is right. The Sons of Liberty. And they were located not just sometimes in our textbook, and we get it just so quickly. We think, oh, the Sons of Liberty were just up there in Massachusetts, up in Boston. No, they were everywhere. Sons of Liberty were everywhere. These little cells that were, again, coming together. And we would see really those little flickers of flame grow larger over a 10-year period, really. Including, so the right here in Frederick County, one of the things is to take this from a pivot point of Frederick County, where we had our own Sons of Liberty group that was there. And I'm sure maybe there was one here in this area of Virginia, I'm sure at one point, or at least I'm sure in Winchester, that there was probably a like group. But British tax collectors that had been, of course, appointed by the crown were run out of towns eventually, and civil displays of protest utilized effigies of these men. And you can kind of see that there. So not a cool time to be a tax collector. Yes. Of a tax collector. So whoever your tax collector of your colony was would be the one that would really kind of get the wage. But remember back then, with proprietary colonial government there, that these were appointees by the crown. So the governors were slowly but surely losing a little bit of their power because the Sons of Liberty were kind of muckraking and saying, do we really need to listen to these guys? So this was, again, all kind of happening. And again, just the pivot point is to think this was a decade before even, the Declaration and all that. And Continental Congress starting to meet there in the 1770s. So one of the interesting people there, at least in Maryland's part of it, and at least gave us this symbol of the stamp, which is used quite often, was Jonas Green. Jonas Green was the publisher of the Maryland Gazette there, located in Annapolis. And that was, of course, one of the few newspapers that we had that folks could get information from. And Jonas Green was especially concerned about this upcoming Stamp Act because it really would have ruined it. And he was very vocal about it. He had the means by publishing his own newspaper, but he used that opportunity there to really not only inform the masses, but to incite the masses. And his creative use of this skull and crossbones was fantastic. And as you can see, what he was trying to do was to mimic this paper that was supposed to be coming, this famous stamped paper. Was just think of a piece of parchment, and at one point of the parchment, perhaps in the lower right corner, where you would have the actual stamp itself. And that's kind of the symbol of the crown. But how he kind of said, oh, here's what I'm gonna, his spoof or satire was of this skull and crossbones stamp. The fatal stamp. So anyway, Green and others in this trade were quite outspoken and did their best to fuel the flames of discontent among their readership. Now, I'm going to back up for a second and kind of look at Frederick County. And the Frederick County was founded in 1748. Frederick Town, at least our Frederick Town in Maryland, was founded in 1745. And it's interesting because you have your own Frederick County down here, and Winchester was originally Frederick Town. Where does that name Frederick come from? So that is something that I've always been interested in, the name Frederick. And I'm going to kind of jump up a slide and then I'll jump back again. But Frederick, a lot of people have said, or history books have said, well, maybe Frederick came from Frederick Calvert, who was one of the barons of Baltimore, part of the Calvert family that actually founded Maryland. But the Frederick Calvert was a womanizer. He actually had a harem. He could care less about Maryland. He was, further down the line, but he would die, I think, in his 40s. But he wasn't a very good guy, and not a great guy to put a statue up and say that your town or your county was named after. I believe, and others believe, that Prince Frederick Louis, the son of King George II, and the father of King George III, issued the Stamp Act, or back the Stamp Act, as you just saw from that slide at the beginning, that Frederick Louis was the namesake of our Frederick, and I would say Virginia or Winchester, Fredericktown, and Frederick County. And the reason I believe that, and others believe that, is because Prince Frederick Louis, who had a very strained relationship with his father, King George II, was actually left behind at Hanover. Of course, the House of Hanover, but in Germany. And the story of Frederick's founding, and I really don't know as much about Winchester, but with Frederick, Maryland's founding, it was founded by a fellow named Daniel Delaney. He was a lawyer, a land speculator, politician of sorts, a businessman living in Annapolis. It was his idea. He got this patent of Tasker's Chance on the western frontier, and his goal was to lay out a village or a town there and then settle it. But he knew that he wasn't going to have much success with the typical old line Marylanders who had, descended from those families who came with the Calverts in the 1600s. Those people did not want to come into the howling wilderness where there were wild environs and wild people and wild animals. They would rather stay along the Chesapeake Bay and what we call Southern Maryland, a little bit safer, better transportation. They weren't going to come up out this way. And if you think about Virginia to a degree, it was that Tidewater area. And think about, why did it take so long to really settle the backlands? I mean, people that really wanted to get away would get away and come out this way. But really, as far as really a major settlement, that wasn't the case. And in Maryland's case, Fredericktown, founded in 1745, was on the western frontier. Daniel Delaney looked to his north, and Virginia authorities did the same, and saw that William Penn was having success. He was having great success settling the interior. And how was he doing it? Immigrants, but what kind of immigrants? Immigrants from Germany. So German immigrants, think of Pennsylvania, Dutch country. So a lot of Germans were being recruited because William Penn was recruiting these people from the old world and from London. A lot of Germans were trying to get out of Germany because of the upheaval and all these states fighting with each other and religious situations. So there had been for decades, a lot of Germans there going to London, hoping for passage over to the New World. And Philadelphia, a lot of you with German roots or have done German genealogy know that Philadelphia was a major port of entry for Germans because they were welcome there. So much so that the Penns had set up Germantown. Now I'm sure at the docks were saying, welcome to the city of brotherly love. We would love for you to stay with us in Philadelphia, but we set up a place called Germantown. Take the hint, go west. I'm being facetious here, but that's part of it. So again, looking at the Germans settling the interior. Why? Well, the Germans were God-fearing, frugal people, very family-oriented. as opposed to the slave plantation model that you could see in Maryland and Virginia being used, especially with the earlier immigration of families here. But again, a guy like Daniel Delaney was really thinking from the beginning, I'm going to try to recruit Germans to start my city. And he went up and he tried, he attempted, and he was successful in cherry picking a lot of Germans from Pennsylvania Dutch country. And he also had circulated advertisements in Europe as well. And we are very proud there, down here too, but we're very proud of our German heritage there, Frederick. And of course, once the Germans were there, we had a lot of English, Scots, Irish coming up from Southern Maryland, and we have this interesting culture clash, and that's part of Frederick's story as well. But the neat thing is with this Frederick Lewis, I think that is why you apply a name of Frederick, because it's attractive to German people. German people were familiar with Prince Frederick Lewis. Now, Prince Frederick Lewis, of course, was just like we thought, some of us thought that maybe Prince Charles would never get his chance, that his mother might live forever. And now it's so strange that King Charles, not Prince Charles anymore. But unfortunately, Prince Frederick Lewis never got his opportunity. He died in 1751. His father, King George II, would die in 1760. So he never got his chance, but it was Prince Frederick Lewis's son, George III, who would attain the throne upon his grandfather's death. So I think it's kind of cute and clever and interesting too, that this Stamp Act repudiation that was put forth by the Frederick County Court Justices, a county named for King George's father, would be the ones who would have the first protest by a body, a kind of a formed body. But anyway, I'll get to that in a second. Back to their courts. So I don't know how it worked here, but I know that that it was probably very common as it was in Frederick County. You can see the scope. In the 1750s, this is how large Frederick County, Maryland was. It pretty much encompassed not only Washington County and Allegheny and Garrett County to the west, but it also consisted of today's Montgomery County, Maryland, and most of Carroll County, Maryland. And so Frederick was pretty big. It was originally part of Prince George's County, but in 1748, it would become, thanks to Daniel Delaney, pushing really to kind of help his little holding of Fredericktown, which he had laid out. And he figured, I can get out of Prince George's County and have my own county here. So he lobbied for Frederick County and for Fredericktown to be the seat of the county. And that is where all the transactions, the court transactions, would be done. And that court would meet seasonally. And the next court to come up was the annual November court. So if you figure if they met every 3 months or so, there was transactions that had to be done for the November court because that was the last court of the year. And you would have to wait another 3 months for the next court. So with this announcement that this stamped paper would have to be utilized starting November 1st, well, what's going to happen with the November court, the November Frederick County Court, where you would need this paper or paper of some sort to record the happenings of the court and any agreements and other things that transpired that week. So again, this just wanted to kind of put that in perspective and set the stage of the time. And our original courthouse, for those of you who visited Frederick City, Maryland there, that our current City Hall sits on the footprint of what is called Court Square or Courthouse Square. And that was the scene of our county courthouse until the 80s, when a new county courthouse would be built a block to the south. And at that time, the old Frederick County Courthouse became Frederick City Hall. It had moved from a location on North Market Street, which is today a restaurant called Brewer's Alley. Brewer's Alley restaurant there. So that was City Hall, but City Hall is now. But we the building that is today's Frederick City Hall was the Frederick County Courthouse, but it was the third Frederick County Courthouse built in that area. And that one had been built beginning part of the Civil War. There's still some little chicanery going around. They don't know what happened there, but it caught on fire, and some said it was Confederate rebels or people, the Southern sympathizers that caught on fire. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But that was the third courthouse that was built. We will talk, and I'll show you a rendition of the first courthouse. These are some renditions of what the first courthouse could have looked like from a couple different books. But regardless, no, not out of that book, but out of some other history books. But the book on the right, though, is a very interesting book because it is the cover page of the November court, the minutes of the November court. And that is not stamped paper that the minutes were taken on there. So this is actually, and I've actually, I'm sorry I couldn't bring it here today, but I've actually held that minute book in my hand, and I taught back in 2015. I taught a course over, I teach courses at Frederick Community College, the Institute for Learning and Retirement, and we did an all-day, all you could want to know about the Stamp Act. We did an all-day class, and I had Sandy Dalton, our clerk of the county court, come in, and it had always been a tradition where the clerk of the court would actually read the, at least the resolution, the repudiation to ladies of the Frederick chapter, DAR chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution chapter. So she actually brought the book with her, and all the students, I think I had about 40 people there taking the class. They got to look and take pictures and see the actual book itself, which was pretty cool. But from that book, we have the repudiation, and just, it's one of those terms that's not thrown around a lot, and you don't use it a lot unless perhaps you're a lawyer, perhaps. But repudiation, defined by Webster's rejection of a proposal or idea, refusal to fulfill or discharge an agreement or obligation, or denial of the truth or validity of something. And that is exactly what occurred on the day of November 23rd, 1765, because this court, this Frederick court, had been meeting, and all of a sudden, the Chief Justice of this county court, all of a sudden, Thomas Beatty, read out this response. It is the unanimous resolution and opinion of this court that all the business thereof shall and ought to be transacted in the usual and accustomed manner without any inconvenience or delay to be occasioned from the want of stamped paper, parchment, or vellum, and that all proceedings shall be valid and effectual without the use of stamps. And they enjoin and order all sheriffs, clerks, counselors, attorneys, and all officers of the court to proceed in their several avocations as usual, which resolution and opinion are grounded on the following and other reasons. And not to take all day here, but basically to summarize, no instruction was given on how to use the stamps, and there was no stamped paper in hand as of yet. So that was the rationale that they gave for really kind of thumbing their nose at Parliament in Great Britain. So kind of an amazing situation. And the appointed clerk of the county court, John Darnell, he had failed to comply and cooperate with the order of the justices, stating that he would not conduct the duties associated with his office appointed by the governor and proprietary of Maryland. By doing that, by making that stand that this fellow John Darnell did, he was arrested and ordered to the county jail. So a lot of kind of fun things going on there in Frederick as part of the November Court of 1765. And here is actually the part of that November minutes book that says, ordered that John Darnell, clerk of the court, be committed to the custody of the sheriff of this county for being in contempt of the authority of this court. He having refused to comply with the aforegoing order of this court to pretty much execute the duties of his office. So again, to review, you had the Chief Justice of the court saying, screw it, we don't have paper in hand. We've got to conduct some business, important business here. And looks like the clerk of the court isn't going to participate. He's going against what we're kind of his bosses in this case. So we're throwing him in jail. That's what they did. Still had no stamp paper, but they threw him in jail. So for this, and again, as I kind of talked about the groundswell ahead, whether it be from Jonas Green and the rabble rousing he did in the newspaper, the citizens worried about this, the Sons of Liberty going, hell yeah, let's go. They were excited, and that these justices, these court justices from all over that large Frederick County, as I showed you, and their names are on the screen, that these would be the immortal justices of Frederick. That they actually stood up against the crown. And I know I've mentioned this, and I'll probably mention it again, that in a way, if Lexington and Concord was the shot heard around the world, the real shot, then this perhaps was the verbal shot. That maybe wasn't heard around the world, but it should have been. And I just wonder if, and that's one thing I've never been able to prove, if King George III was briefed on the subject that there's this little hick town called Frederick Town. It's in the Maryland colony, and the justices were unruly. And then he goes, Frederick, was that name for my father? You know, who knows? That's kind of maybe fantasy in my mind, but it would be really cool. Has anybody ever seen, I'm sure most of you, because we're all history wonks in this room, see the John Adams HBO series? It was on about 12 years ago, based on David McCullough's book. I tell people all the time, especially young people, watch that series, that documentary, because it really paints the founding fathers in a way that they are real people. And it's just so neat to see. And there are some very interesting scenes in there of protests and other things. And of course, Sam Adams plays a big role in there. We're now just known for beer, but what he was doing back then. But it was really cool to kind of see that period and think about this in that time period, that these fellas came together. And it's hard to really separate the thought of, we were a subject of Great Britain. And here this group kind of went against this little group here in Frederick, went against it. But the act by the Frederick County justices serves as the first protest against King George III and the crown by an official and judicial body in the colonies. So again, let me read that. The act by the Frederick County justices served as the first protest against King George III and the crown by an official and judicial body in the colonies. Because there were other little incidents around the colonies, some here in Virginia. I think there was something in Westmoreland County. There was also Patrick Henry was connected to one, but this was the first by a judicial body. And that is why, I guess, at least in Frederick, for years and years, why we made it such a big deal, because this was a daring deed, which could have resulted in grave, literal and figuratively, grave consequences for each of these 12 men that are up on the screen there. And again, as I said later, they were called the Immortals, the 12 Immortals, or the Immortal Justices of Frederick. I was able to find this some years ago. This is a comic little lampoon drawing that appeared in the Baltimore Sun by artist John Steeves. This is from the 60s. Matter of fact, at the time, the anniversary back in 1965. And it's an interesting aspect of what had followed. What the court did on the 23rd was followed with a big party, you can even say that, a week later. And this John Steeves, like I said, did this great little depiction, artistic depiction of the burial and funeral of the Stamp Act. So not was it enough that our immortal justices actually went ahead and did court business, but a week later, the townspeople really planned by the Sons of Liberty actually had this mock funeral for the Stamp Act, saying that the justices killed the Stamp Act. And we shouldn't really pay our respects, but we should rejoice at this situation. And that's exactly what happened November 30th. The citizenry turned out for a grand parade. And as I said, it was planned by the Sons of Liberty, and it paid tribute to the deed of the Frederick justices and their act in executing the infamous and unpopular Stamp Act. And I had a fella in Frederick named Richard Schleck, very talented artist. He's done work for the National Park Service and museums all over the country. But I explained this whole idea to him. I was able to receive a little bit of grant money. This is during our anniversary year back in 2015. And I had him actually paint a depiction of perhaps what that execution burial of the Stamp Act would have looked like. And again, I know I'm in the way here, causing feedback, but it's a great drawing. I love it. This is the gallows. Matter of fact, in the world of political correctness, when we submitted this, and we actually, as this part, I'll show you, I have a slide later where this appears on a tabletop interpretive panel exhibit that is in Courthouse Square. Of course, the political correctness in Frederick City wouldn't let me have a gallows in it. So we actually had to Photoshop out the gallows. But anyway, but you're seeing the original portrait here. And what we have here is a horse and wagon that participated in that parade as they paraded through the streets of Frederick on the way to the gallows, where there was a casket or a coffin in the back of this wagon. And the coffin held the departed Stamp Act within it. And the lone mourner was this guy right here, or this guy right here, was an effigy of the tax collector, a fellow named Zachariah Hood, the most popular guy in Maryland at the time. So he was the lone mourner being held up here by this fella, and there was the coffin. And they had the gallows. This perhaps could have been what the original Frederick County Courthouse looked like. And of course, Sons of Liberty there have some interesting slogans there on signs. And there are points where you would see a Phrygian cap. Has anybody ever heard of a Phrygian cap before? And it's a red cap, and there's a whole story behind it, a protest from I think it was Eastern European country or something like that happened. But anyway, this is what we have here. Supposedly they had, yes. Yeah. Steeves, John Steeves was the artist for the Baltimore, a very popular artist back in the 60s. But on the actual coffin itself, it said the Stamp Act expired of a mortal stab rendered free or liberty, free whatever, but by the court justices. But that was supposedly written on the casket, and yeah, it was quite a scene. And what they did is they dug a hole there in Courthouse Square, and they actually buried the coffin after, and then they had a big party across the street. Yes, sir. The tax collector, Zachariah Hood. Well, it's not him. It's an effigy. He ran out of town. He got out. No, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it would have been. That would have been. I'm sure if he would have showed his face in Frederick that day, probably wouldn't have ended very well for him. But there he is, right there. As a matter of fact, I think from what I recall, and it's been a while, I think he fled to New York. There was, of course, a lot of loyalists in New York, and he hid out there for a while and then went over. Yes, sir. Yes. They're appointed by the governor. And a lot of them were big. No, nope. Most of them are, yeah, not too many Germans in there. But wouldn't you think that there was more of a connection? And think about how many Germans were part of Continental Congress. How many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence could you say were of German stock? Well, yeah. Well, these were a lot of these guys were some of your more wealthy landowners, so they were representing their neighbors, and again in a smaller time, a smaller Maryland colony at that time where people were more spread out. Your upper level folks there kind of called the shots, more of the shots. But I think just like what would happen 10 years later with Continental Congress, you figure you kind of followed them. I mean, it's again, guys, I mean, from our Frederick side, guys like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, were recognized. I mean, just even if you think about candidates, you think about the political election last week or what have you, sometimes that name recognition is thing, and people who have more money there to put more advertisements on TV or more things in your mailbox. Whether you really know, have you really sat down with them and talked about the issues, or are other people telling you what? And I think here, these guys, I think, were trying to represent, not only their own holdings, but trying to look out for their neighbors. So they must have been somewhat likable, but they were appointed and there wasn't an election for them. So it's an interesting case, but they bucked. I think it was basically a point where you were kind of fed up that even from the royal governors that, are they really looking out for your best interest? And these guys were coming directly from Great Britain and coming in here. And when their time was up or whatever, they were go back to Great Britain. They really didn't, in a lot of these cases, really kind of saw it as a job. But there was the haves and have-nots. And I think that people could see that right then and there, that we are a colony where we think of ourselves as equal to the common Englishman, but we aren't. We're different. We're the redheaded stepchild. And I think even within the colony itself, now this was happening. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about even Frederick, with Frederick, Maryland and Frederick County, and not being named for the Calvert family, over the time, Maryland was founded in 1634, but the Calverts at the very beginning were very influential and very supportive, but over time, their power was somewhat stripped by the Crown and Parliament too. I mean, Maryland, getting off subject here, but Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony. Well, eventually, when King James was kicked off the throne, William and Mary, came back and Catholicism was outlawed. So Catholicism was outlawed in Maryland, which was a Catholic colony and founded on religious freedom. And so again, I think a lot of people saw a lot of hypocrisy, and this, it's no wonder the way things led down the road that they led to. We know a little bit, how can I put together that drawing, or how can we have these accounts and history books of what happened? Well, the Maryland Gazette, our friend Jonas Green, on December 15th, went back into printing his Maryland Gazette. He had quit in November because of the stamped paper decree. And he had ceased publication October 31st, one day before November 1st, when that Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect. In this December 15th paper, on the front page, he reveled in printing news from Frederick of this Stamp Act repudiation parade. And again, sorry, I'm blocking the way. But here, Frederick County, Saturday, the 30th of November, he said the Stamp Act, having received a mortal wound by the hands of justice, this is exactly what was written there on that casket. He talked about the body lay exposed to public ignominy until yesterday, when it was thought proper that it said that, of course, the justices had killed the Stamp Act on the 23rd. It laid around for a week, and there was such a stench that everybody thought it needs to be properly buried. And the Sons of Liberty assembled at the house of Mr. Samuel Swearingen in the afternoon, and the coffin was taken up exactly at 3 o'clock. And here was the procession. They formed a whole procession with drum, fife and drum corps and all this. So it was really a well orchestrated and planned event. It's funny, I was just coming through Brunswick and I was thinking of the coordination that goes into last Saturday or last Sunday, they had their annual Veterans Day parade. So I'm thinking, of course, you have to have organization for that. So here, these folks, and again, this was quite risky to do. Just kind of interesting that again, it would happen, and that not only this would be read by Marylanders, but I found this same article reprinted in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston newspapers from the time. The little old Frederick got on the map big time, way before Barbara Fritchie, here with this Stamp Act repudiation. So I guess, you know, we really kind of saw us as having some moxie down here. The Stamp Act would eventually be repealed on March 18, 1766. It really was a big flop. Some members of Parliament like William Pitt, namesake for Pittsburgh, successfully argued the plight of the colonists and this ill of taxation without representation. This led, of course, to the repeal of the act in March of the next year. And the Stamp Act would go on to be lampooned on both sides of the Atlantic in newspapers and in magazines. And I mentioned, again, William Pitt, and not to go too far into it, but Parliament, we had two major friends in Parliament. William Pitt was one. Another guy named William Barry Vermont is named for him. But they were very vocal to Parliament, saying, you know, these colonists here, you kind of cut them out. You expect them to pay just like the rest of us Englishmen here, but they are second-class citizens, and it's wrong. So again, we knew that we were starting to get some support there in the mother country. And one of the big things that Pitt and Barry used as the basis of their arguments in front of Parliament was actually a very long titled work by Daniel Delaney the Younger, who was a great lawyer, and you should be familiar because Daniel Delaney the Younger was the son of Daniel Delaney the Elder, the founder of Frederick. So his son, the Younger, was probably one of the greatest lawyers in our colonial history. And he had written this whole response about taxation without representation. And it was really, like I said, the basis of these arguments. And just another interesting connection to Frederick, because when his father died, he would take on the selling of lots and further growth of Frederick, and was one of Frederick County, really, when Frederick County came about, he was one of the representatives in the Maryland General Assembly for the new fledgling Frederick County. Unfortunately, he would not believe in going to war against the crown. So during the American Revolution, he was seen as a Tory loyalist and lost most of his family fortune and holdings because of that. If any of you are familiar with the Towson area, you will see when you're going on the Beltway there, a sign for Delaney Valley Road. And actually, when Delaney the Younger, this great lawyer, was stripped of everything, he begged that if he and his family could keep one holding, and it's called the Valley of the Jehoshaphat, and above Towson, and that's where he would live out his days there. But that's a little interesting tidbit that you can impress your friends and neighbors with the name where Delaney Valley comes from. And he is, Delaney the Younger is buried in Old St. Paul's Cemetery in Baltimore, not far from the University of Maryland Medical Center and Camden Yards. But it was the original, that was the original burial place of one Francis Scott Key before he was moved to Frederick. And Daniel, next time you go to Annapolis, in the circle in Annapolis there around St. Anne's Church, I think Episcopal Church, is that St. Anne's? I think it is. There, Daniel Delaney the Elder, the founder of Frederick, buried right next to Benjamin Tasker, who was a good friend, but those are the guys who really kind of did the first land dealings out our way in Frederick. But back to our story with the Stamp Act, as I said, it was lampooned. Then the Sons of Liberty would ramp up. They had this little successful party in Frederick. So now it was fair game. Sons of Liberty started doing things all over the colonies. And this unification was slowly growing between provincial towns and colonies themselves outside of the realm of these appointed royal governors and leadership. And further protests would counter additional taxing attempts by Parliament and the Crown. So again, the blueprint had been drawn up, and even though maybe judicial bodies didn't do the same thing, these Sons of Liberty were great because they started communicating with each other. And then you started seeing things like committees of safety and committees of communication. Actually, these groups started talking between colonies, because before that they weren't doing it. We were all in vacuums as colonies. And of course, that would eventually lead up to the calling for a Continental Congress. And we all know how that went. Of course, things like the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Boston gets a lot of the attention there for the events that happened up there. But it's always great that we can kind of butt into the conversation and say that we played a role down here as well. And then we had organized leadership from great statesmen in all of our colonies. And two of those, at least in my neck of the woods, were Thomas Johnson Jr. and John Hanson. And Thomas Johnson Jr. is the namesake of my alma mater high school, Thomas Johnson High School. And he should have signed the Declaration of Independence, but was busy raising troops and supplies for the revolution, a member of Continental Congress as he was, but he also gave us a place called Kentucky Furnace. He was a businessman as well. But Thomas Johnson was said to be the person who actually put George Washington's name in front of Continental Congress to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And Johnson led troops, Maryland troops, in the Revolution up there at the Battle of Long Island, but he was recalled from the battlefield to become our first elected governor of Maryland. So kind of coming back around again with that governor theme. John Hanson was a great lawyer and statesman. Was based in Annapolis, but we had too many great lawyers there. So he came to Frederick, where he could be a big fish in a small pond. And he would eventually go on to be a president of Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation. So some people say, very interesting, and it is a little question on Jeopardy, or it has been a question on Jeopardy, who was the first president, John Hanson. And he was the first to serve a one-year term over that body. From what I did some deep research on it some years ago and found that actually he was like the 8th guy who held that position, but he was the first. It was a 6-month position, but he was the first to hold a 1-year term. And at the time that he held it, nobody was coming to the meetings anymore. So, and he did it for a year. They begged him because nobody wanted the job to do it a second year. But he was in very ill health and came back to Frederick, was here shortly, went back to his plantation of Oxon Hill, and he died there. And
we had Peter Michael here talking about this, so don't say that to him.
I know Pete Michael very well. And one of the things that Pete Michael, as he is a descendant of Hanson, there was a fella in the 1930s who wrote a book during the Depression, who was a descendant, and who actually was the one to put forth this claim of his ancestor was the first president. So, oh well, there you go. So what did I say earlier about embellishment and history books? But anyway, but John Hanson was a great guy. Route 50 in Maryland is named for the John Hanson Highway. And John Hanson, unfortunately, don't have him there in Mount Olivet. I wish we did. His wife is buried in Mount Olivet. Wish I knew exactly where she is. She doesn't have a marker per se because she's in a mass grave with 200 other folks that used to be buried in the Protestant Episcopal burying ground of Frederick that were moved there in 1913. John Hanson was supposedly buried in a family crypt on his property, but they haven't been able to find his body ever. So supposedly some guys like about 15 years ago, it's kind of like when Geraldo was trying to find Al Capone's lost vault or treasure trove or whatever. These guys thought they found it and he wasn't in there. So if you find John Hanson, let us know. So anyway, but very interesting. And of course they would be our kind of connections. And in Maryland too, we had our own Tea Party, the burning of the Peggy Stewart, which happened in 1774, where we had a Maryland firm that was awaiting their tea, and it was out there. They wouldn't let the ship come into port, and some rabble rousers went out there and set it on fire. owners had to watch it burn. And that was in 1774. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, with this first shot heard around the world in Lexington and Concord in 1775. And, our little Stamp Act was 10 years earlier. So just another interesting connection there. And speaking of immortals, we talked about with the signing of the Declaration of Independence and those guys kind of following in the footsteps of our Frederick immortals later on. So I guess if you can use your John Hanson was the first president, then I can say, well, these guys in Philadelphia in July of 1776 were pretty sharp, but our guys in November of 1765, they were the first judicial body to raise claim and go against the crown. And one of those fellows who signed the Declaration of Independence right across the river, literally and figuratively, I guess, too, but Charles Carroll of Carrollton, many of you familiar, and I know at least there's one direct resident or two specific residents of Carrollton Manor. I'm looking at them right now. But Carrollton Manor in Frederick was actually a land patent that Charles Carroll, the settler, had supposedly purchased from the native peoples back in the 1720s. His grandson, also named Charles Carroll, as was Charles Carroll, Carrollton's father was Charles Carroll. So we had multiple Charles Carroll, but to differentiate himself from his father and grandfather, took on the name of Carrollton based on this land. So in a way, Frederick County, Maryland, through Carrollton Manor, is on the Declaration of Independence. So we've got that going for us too. Yes, it did. Very large parcel, basically from just south of Frederick City all the way to the Potomac River and the land in between Catoctin Mountain and Sugarloaf Mountain. So finally, kind of wrapping up here with some legacies that we have today that at least remind us of the immortal justices and that great act of November 23rd, 1765, and of course the party and funeral that happened a week later. When I worked for tourism, Frederick County Tourism, Downtown Frederick Partnership was doing this series of markers around town, this Frederick Heritage Trail marker. And if you walk the streets of Frederick there, the sidewalks, Market Street, Patrick Street, you'll see plenty of these. But right there in front of Frederick City Hall, we have this bronze plaque that gives homage to the court justices and reads that famous resolution. It is a unanimous resolution opinion of this court that business therein shall and ought to be transacted. My former boss, John Feaster, used to be the executive director of tourism for Frederick. He just retired a couple years ago, and here he is right here on the extreme left. But John, when we were coming up with ideas of how to commemorate this event, he wanted to see, he goes, wouldn't it be neat if we could do some kind of ground penetrating radar and see if we could have an archaeologist find wood shards or anything from that coffin that was buried. And if we could we dig out a little bit of the ground and leave it exposed? And you see, perhaps, I mean, in our mind, our vision was, boy, if you could still see the coffin or what remains of the coffin, and then put a piece of plexiglass above so you could look down and see it buried underneath. But we knew that wasn't going to work, and the city wasn't going to let us do that. So they'd even taken the gallows off our marker. This is the unveiling that we did of that interpretive marker that sits right outside of Frederick City Hall on Courthouse Square, the place where this event happened all those years ago. So we're pretty excited about that. It's just kind of, again, just a sign of hanging people, and I know, but it just, the gallows itself is a sign of whatever. So people push back on it. So just imagine it. If you look at the thing, just imagine the version I showed you there, but it is what it is. But I'm just glad we've got something there to at least bring this thing. And in 1894, the Maryland General Assembly made it this holiday. They had a resolution put forth that they made Stamp Act, or they made Repudiation Day, November 23rd, this half-day bank holiday. And again, it was celebrated, I'm sure, near and far for years, but now I think people don't really know about it. Frederick DAR will be celebrating. And again, I think each of you on November 23rd, coming up here soon, that you will at least think about those court justices and think about the Stamp Act being buried. So with that, I guess I'm ready for questions.
Okay, before we do that, those of you who have been here before know that it's our custom at this point in the program to pass the hat. We don't charge admission for these lectures. We don't sell tickets, but we do collect money. And Mike over here and Nancy over here will be our collection agents here. We won't call them tax collectors.
Yeah, they're right.
That could be dangerous here.
I think we're ready to protest.
Yeah.
No, it's for a good cause.
I mean, just a note for anybody maybe who's brand new and doesn't know it. This area here, Lovettsville, previously known as the German settlement, was for all intents and purposes really part of Frederick County at this time, at that time back there, and actually for a long time after that, had more social ties, church ties, family ties to Frederick County than to Loudoun County. So anything that happened in Frederick County would have been watched very closely here, and probably the Germans here would have been much better informed about what was going on in Frederick County than anything in Leesburg and Loudoun County at that time. And for some people, that was true up until a couple decades ago, I think. We have a lot of people in this area, old timers who were born at FMH at the hospital up there. I remember when I first came here about 40 years ago, these was when newspapers were delivered in little boxes. The largest number of those newspaper boxes were Frederick News Post. And then a far second was the Washington Post, I think. So that's where people are oriented. So this is not about some distant county someplace else. This is about something that's part of our history.
Yeah, I kind of echoed that same statement a couple of years ago. I was invited to, I guess, Luckett's elementary school.
Yeah.
And I did a project on talking about prehistory. And that was the same. I mean, even going back millions of years, there were no county lines or state lines, and the history of our region was kind of a shared history. So.
Well, and Luckett's, the Luckett's of Lovettsville were the family of the judge Luckett's, who's part of the 12 Immortals.
One of the immortals, yep.
Right.
Yes.
The language of
yeah.
So to see what they were doing, the broader
You know, it's a well, again, it just, and it leads in, it's such a great question because it leads in, I know I teased it earlier. I really think this thing was planned from the start. I think that these guys knew we're going to do this because we've got money riding on this, whether it was land transactions or legal things, that we cannot wait until the next year. But there's something really neat about this, and I have, when I went into detail with him to really get to this of why I think it was a concerted effort. The individuals at play here, again, especially, so this Thomas Beatty was the Chief Justice. And we had some of the individuals, 3 individuals that were the justices, 3 of the justices. 2 of them had the last name of Bell or Beal. It looks like Beal, B-E-A-L-L. And not far from here over the Dickerson area is Bellsville. And these Bell, Beal were connected to that area. There was another guy named James Dixon who actually owned a property that many of us, and if you're familiar with Frederick, would know as Prospect Hall. It was also the former site of St. John's Regional School. Prospect Hall, but it was called Dixon's Struggle. So this James Dixon owned Dixon's Struggle, these two bells from Bellsville. Now, again, I wish I could pull it up on the screen, but it's in another PowerPoint with all the steps that we had to go through here. I don't want to change anything here. But what I started doing, and I didn't see this anywhere. I didn't see it anywhere. What I did is I really read those minutes. And a lot of it, okay, there were cases and stuff, but that whole unanimous decision stuff was on the last day of the court. They had been meeting all week. Wouldn't you think that that would be the introductory preamble? Okay, the court session, we're starting now. Now, I'm just going to say it's the unanimous decision of this court that we're going to go ahead and transact business for the next week. They did all the business first. And at the very end of it, because they started the session, I want to say it was like the 15th or 16th. So the very last day of the session was the 23rd, and that's where they give this. So it's kind of like, well, that's great. You already did everything, and now you're going to go. But what they did is they did that whole unanimous decision. It all came after they introduced a case. They introduced a case which involved a fellow named James Beach. And just to summarize it, this James Beach, it said in the case of this James Beach, this suit was brought on by a guy named Stephen West Jr. And supposedly Stephen West Jr. was after this James Beach because James Beach owed him money of some sort. And there was another guy named Michael Dowden who was involved in this, who had put up, I guess, bail for James Beach. And Michael Dowden owned a tavern in northern Montgomery County, right on the old Georgetown Pike. And I'm kind of wondering why this is so disjointed. Why didn't they cover this case earlier? Why is this the only case on the last day of the court session? They bring up this case, this Stephen West is a plaintiff against a defendant, this James Beach, who once again had been bailed out or helped out by this Michael Dowden, who was an ordinary keeper. And they start the case, and then they go right into this whole unanimous decision thing. And then they end up, this John Darnell, clerk of the court, is in contempt of the court. And then they throw him in jail. And that is really what that's pretty much, and then they threw him in jail or committed him to jail. And then they just said, okay, our work here is done. But they didn't continue this case with Beach and West. All right, like I said, I know this is abstract. I wish I had visuals to show you all this to keep it straight. So I read this and I'm just like pondering, because that's what I do. And I could have just left it alone, which most normal people do, but I've decided let me find out who these players are. I come to find out that this James Beach, he eventually would die in the Revolutionary War. He eventually went south to South Carolina, was a soldier in the Revolution, got captured, he dies in captivity. I never knew what happened with this case, though, and with Dowden, and I went to Dowden's Ordinary and all that stuff. But this Stephen West was a loyalist, and he was kind of a jerk businessman. Matter of fact, Stephen West was one of the co-owners of that ship, Peggy Stewart, that got burned in Maryland's Tea Party. He and another guy named James Dick they were importers of tea and other things, but they were Great Britain suck-ups. So Stephen West supposedly had some kind of lien on Dixon's Struggle, which I told you would eventually be Prospect Hall. Dixon's Struggle was owned by James Dixon, who was one of the 12 Immortal Justices. A few months before this court case in September, West called in, whatever, took the property, confiscated the property from Dixon. So Dixon has an axe to bear with Stephen West, who just took his property. Now Stephen West is going after James Beach. James Beach, through marriage, is related to the Bell Beals. So I'm looking at it this way, that there were plenty of cases on the docket that were important. They were important, like I said, land and other things. They wanted to make sure we got everything of importance done. Then we're going to make our unanimous decision. We're going to stick it to the Stamp Act on the very last day. Now, one of the other things I'll mention is James Dixon, the Immortal Justice, his father-in-law is John Darnell, the clerk of the court, who they would kick out and throw in jail. That wouldn't go over very well with your wife if you threw her father in jail. I wouldn't want to come home that day if I were James Dixon. I just committed her father. How long was he in jail for? 2 minutes? An hour? Now, again, he is a royal appointee, the clerk of the court is. And I also found that this James Darnell and this Darnell family were a Catholic family, but they were practicing Catholics, but they also were turncoats, because then when they said you can't hold any offices, and they kind of renounced their Catholicism. So I kind of thought, well, they're kind of shady a little bit. They're not as admirable as the Carroll family, Charles Carroll Carrollton, who were out and out Catholics, but were blocked from holding government positions because of their Catholicism. So I see with John Darnell. So now I start seeing the inner workings of this little inner conspiracy, because I think these guys are saying, okay, look, this is to your statement. I think they were thinking, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get all the work of the court done. And then we're going to save this court because we don't like that Stephen West. None of us like Stephen West. We're going to stick it to him at the end, but we're going to at least say that we kind of followed, that at least we didn't do one case because of the stamped paper. Really, they didn't do it because of the stamped paper. They just kind of made their big unanimous resolution, and then they just kind of ended on that. What about the rest of that case? They left it in limbo. So James Veach, the defendant, kind of won the day, at least, against Stephen West. And this Stephen West was stuck to as well. So I really think that it was kind of interesting. And John Darnell, and again, thanks for sticking with me on this. John Darnell, the clerk of the court, oh boy, poor John Darnell, and he's going to the royal governor. Yep, those guys threw me in jail because I was just trying to support you and the crown and parliament. So he protected his job. And Dixon, in a way, saved face of his father-in-law. Does that all make sense? So, yeah, so it's very complicated. And then one thing that is interesting, I love connections. This connections, cool connections. I mean, I was just like, again, when I learned all that, I'm like, oh, nobody talks about any of that. Nobody. And I'm like, that is so amazing if that is what really transpired. This guy, Stephen West, would take Dixon's struggle and he would sell it eventually. He would sell it to Daniel Delaney the Younger, the son of Daniel Delaney the Elder, the founder of Frederick, but the guy who wrote the great response to the Stamp Act that was used in Parliament. And then Prospect Hall, Daniel Delaney the Younger would give it to one of his sons, and there was a connection because one of his sons, Benjamin Tasker Delaney, would marry a favorite niece of George Washington's, or grandniece of George Washington's. And that is why the lore has it that Blueskin, the horse of George Washington, I haven't thought about this for years. I don't know why it's in here. I'll forget this all tomorrow. But actually, they say that when Blueskin died, because they were neighbors, Benjamin Tasker Delaney lived next to Mount Vernon on a adjoining property with his favorite niece or grandniece of Washington's or whatever it was. That they said that Blueskin was actually given to Delaney by Washington, and that when Blueskin died, it is somewhere on the property that is today's Prospect Hall. It used to be Dixon's Struggle. And I kept, John and I, my old boss, were laughing when they did all this development there in the last 8 years, or all these luxury condos there. And I kept thinking, I wonder if they'll dig up a horse's carcass there that happened to be George Washington. But getting back to it, this Stephen West, there's that connection. Stephen West Jr. Would have a son named William, I think his name was William Richardson West. William Richardson West would be a brother-in-law of Francis Scott Key. He was married to a sister of Mrs. Key, and he would be the guy when Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem, or Star Spangled Banner, which would become a national anthem. He of course wrote it while he was on a flag of truce out in the Baltimore Harbor watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry. When he was released, he went back to stayed the night in a hotel in Baltimore, rewrote his scribbled up manuscript. His brother-in-law, William Richardson West, I think is his name, would be the guy who would pick him up. And he would say, how you doing, Francis? I'm doing fine. Hey, take a look at this. While I was on the ship, I wrote this. I had this song in my head, and I wrote this about the you know, about the brave soldiers there at Fort McHenry, and the defense of Fort McHenry was what he originally named it. The brother-in-law goes, "This looks really good. I know a newspaper publisher. Do you mind if I take it to him?" So West took it to a newspaper publisher. It, of course, had great success and was reprinted up and down home. So it's amazing how everybody is so connected one way or another. But I really do think that there was definitely collusion among the justices, and they did what they did for, they had a reason involved. Yes, sir.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Said French President Lewis died before he could his son. Why didn't President Lewis have a brother?
I don't know if there was any. So I don't know. I guess I'd have to look at the family tree of George II and stuff. But I think I don't think he had any other siblings. So it just went from the grandfather to the grandson. So George II to George III. I would think so. Yeah. I guess that's what I would think if anybody else knows royal ascension there, but I think that would probably be the case. So, but he never had a chance. But it also gives rise, and I don't know if there's other we have a county in Maryland, Prince Frederick County, or we have a town in Calvert County called Prince Frederick, and that's named for him as well. Yes. Yeah.
How did the members of that survive in several fires?
Yeah. Well, I did. One of the things that we have an old postcard of. Yeah. So people asked, this lady online, somebody asked about how the minute book survived. And the minute book, one of the slides, and I guess my slides are there, one of the things that we have in Frederick is there's a postcard, an old postcard, a picture of what they called the record house, and it was located on Record Street. And the clerk of the court, after John Darnell, eventually there was a guy named William Ritchie who lived on Record Street and actually kept the court records in his house. And there's an old, like I said, an old postcard from the early 1900s. I have a slide up that actually showed that. And a lot of times in history books, when they would say it was almost a mistake to be, people would say that was where the repudiation happened. That was the courthouse, but that wasn't the courthouse. It was the record house of William Ritchie, who would be the clerk of the court. He lived, I think, into like 1813 or something like that. So the records for some of these fires, I guess, and really there was really just one major fire that destroyed the one in 1862 that destroyed the thing. So I don't know if the records were still in that repository or not. We don't even have that record book in Frederick County. It's been down for decades. It's been down in Annapolis at the Hall of Records there. And I know I did a documentary, a Frederick documentary back in 1995, and our former clerk of the court, Charles Keller, actually, I asked him about the records book because I wanted to look at it. And he actually went to Annapolis and retrieved it and brought it up to me. So I've held it in my hand more than a few times. But that's where it is. And then when we had this commemoration period there, Sandy had it on loan for about a week and a half. And we had it up in Frederick. But we're lucky that it's there, and hopefully they don't have a fire of any sort. But that's how we were able to obtain it.
One more question. Did any colonies actually comply with that, or
Yeah, so again, the question was, did any colonist actually adhere to the Stamp Act? And, I guess I haven't really looked into that. I would think that maybe perhaps some did. The big problem was this stamp paper and who was getting the stamp paper. And it just seemed like with the protest against, with it being overseas and a lot of people weren't going to put up with it, that I'm sure maybe a couple people did, but it became such a joke that I think on both sides, they just kind of abandoned ship on it. And that, led to in March of them repealing the act. So I don't know if it was, to what extent it was used, but I would bet somebody used it. And there are pieces of it, I guess I had maybe a visual early on in the PowerPoint, but of what it actually looked like, that you can actually see it where it has the crown, the seal of the crown on it and everything. Well, no, that was, I mentioned earlier the versions of paper that it was, but what happened is back to tea, I mean, there were taxes on sugar. I mean, they just kept coming out with it. So, okay, well, they were not the Stamp Act. It's like, well, no, stamp's not going to work. So let's put a tax on sugar. Let's put a tax on tea. Let's put a tax. So, and they were able to succeed in some areas better than others. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think a lot has been made of it, but I think it it is very interesting. And you just think, I mean, even if you look at cities of the Eastern Seaboard, and I mean, even if we look at just last week with elections and politics, and to think that, okay, well, in major cities of the East Coast, I mean, are liberal cities, and people perhaps are more apt to go along with government mandates and government things where you're going to get more pushback from the backcountry. Maybe even with thinking about things, whether it's COVID restrictions or things that we've seen in the last couple of years.